Good morning. My name is James Roby. I look after the sustainability or the environmental sustainability agenda at Capgemini. I've been with Capgemini for about 25 years and started my journey there looking after clients as an account exec, and after 6 or 7 years moved into the area of sustainability when sustainability really didn't exist as a topic. So I was responsible for building a program first for Capgemini in the United Kingdom, and then after that I was asked whether I could take the agenda globally, and I've been driving that agenda since 2008. What I wanted to do today was share with you some of the trends that we see shaping the corporate sustainability agenda. So just going to unpack that and then share perhaps a few examples that we're doing at Capgemini. And then there'll be a round table a little bit later where we'll then be able to hopefully have some dialogue and some conversation. So 4 key trends, and I've divided them into 2 parts. The first part is the macroeconomic or the geopolitical, and the second part is more driven by stakeholder expectations. And then we'll think about how should business respond? How can we respond? Is this a challenge? Is this an opportunity? Or is it both? So let me start at the top with the macroeconomic and the geopolitical trends. And the first one I've put there is the fragile food and energy systems. I think if we look back over the last 12 to 18 months, we have seen unprecedented disturbance in those systems. I've put here the wheat price and the maize price, and you can just see over the last couple of years, those are increasing by between 30 and 50%. And it's always worth thinking about this for what this really means for those people living at the extremes of the world. For the middle classes, for the wealthy, yes, it's a little bit annoying that our bread price or our maize prices are going up. But for many, this is an affordability issue, which then becomes a real social issue. So what's driving this? Well, the other thing which is worth looking at is, from a food system perspective, just how dependent we are on fertilizers, and particularly just how dependent we are on energy, synthetic-based fertilizers. You can see the lines here. You can see how since 1920 the world population has massively increased. That's the blue line. Sorry, the text is a bit small, but I'll try and explain the lines. The orange line is where we would be able to have driven our global food system without synthetic-based fertilizers. And you can see the gray line, which is the impact of those synthetic-based fertilizers. Now, why talk about fertilizer? It's not terribly exciting a topic, but it is incredibly linked to energy, another of the systems which is under stress at the moment. And so here, I've put in a chart from The Economist on the left, the global fertilizer price. You can just see how the fertilizer price has absolutely shot up over the last 2 years, very, very linked to the price of natural gas, which is the main energy input into fertilizer. So as we see these energy inputs increase, we see the fertilizer inputs increase, and we see the price flow through. The Economist wrote a paper, or one of their magazines a little while ago, in terms of the coming food catastrophe. And there's some Guardian coverage there as well. And I guess that catastrophe is in 2 perspectives. First of all, there's a cost perspective in terms of we looked at some of the the cost implications of the energy rise. But anybody who's working in the agricultural sector will also know that we have significant challenges in terms of land degradation. One of the most frightening statistics that somebody shared with me last year was an estimate that, based on current farming techniques, we probably have somewhere between 60 and 70 more harvests. i.e., we can carry on harvesting for 60 or 70 more years. At that point, the soils will be totally depleted and there will be virtually no food coming through the system. Now that's either within our lifetime or our children's lifetime. So I think food is a major disruption which is likely to happen, and the linkage between food and energy is quite critical. I know many of you here today are working in the energy sector. So that's the first of the trends. The second trend I wanted to pick out was some of the economic uncertainty at the moment. And again, I've put this chart up here. I always think this is a really interesting chart. This is the oil price over the last 50 years. And many of you will remember July 2008, when the oil price practically hit $150 a barrel. From an economics perspective, that was a fascinating moment. It was about 8 weeks before the US banks started collapsing. And there are many economists who will argue that it was the oil price that was the trigger for the collapse in those US banks. And in the same way we looked at the linkage between the gas price and the fertilizer price, when you look at oil, you suddenly realize there's an incredible linkage between the oil price and pretty much anything. When I'm teaching with my students, one of the questions I often ask is, find me one thing in this room which is not linked to oil. We have all sorts of answers. In this room, people would probably point at the trees, to which I would say they probably were brought here by truck, which was probably using oil. Some people talk about the air in the room not being dependent on oil. There's air conditioning systems in here which are presumably powered by electricity. Now, I know a lot of the electricity here in Brazil is green energy, but I'm sure that there is some oil-based in the mix. The only thing that ever gets me, and very few people come up with this answer, the only thing I think I can't link back to oil in this room is the sunlight that is coming through the window. So pretty much everything in our economy, from the floor to the chairs to the carpets to everything else, is linked to the oil price. And when the oil price goes up, it has a knock-on impact on the economy. And so the view there was when we hit about $150 a barrel, then that knocked the economy into recession. And then the massive drop in 2009 was because the economy tipped into recession. So I think the oil price is always quite fascinating. What was really interesting was, from a climate perspective, if you look at this period between 2010 and 2013, where we saw high oil prices, one of the things which we look at is, well, what did that trigger? And unfortunately, what that didn't trigger was a mass migration into the renewable space. What that triggered was a huge investment in the oil industry into alternative sources of oil. So tar sands, oil shale. And unfortunately, they are even dirtier than regular oil from a carbon perspective. So in some ways, that period in the first half of the 2010s was a bit of a lost decade in terms of that energy transition. Thankfully, as the prices have gone up more recently and the cost of renewables, particularly the cost of solar, has dropped, we are now starting to see that transition. But while the oil price is going up, then that is driving inflation. I've taken this picture from one of the UK newspapers. I know in Latin America, inflation at 10% isn't quite such a novelty, not quite such unusual, but certainly in Europe, seeing inflation running at double digits has had a dramatic impact on the economy, has had a dramatic impact in terms of labour relations. Most of the governments in Europe are now trying to stop spiralling wages and spiralling inflation. And as we see, unprecedented levels of striking going on, or certainly within my lifetime, the level of striking going on in many countries is high as this sort of pressure is going. And the final chart I've put here is a business confidence index. And essentially you can see that over the period 2008 through to now. Again, the massive dip. You've got the line in the middle, which is about here, just so that you can see. That's 100%, that's neutral. So when the line is above that 100% point, then people are positive about the economy. When it's below, they are negative and worried about the economy. So you can see that the 2009 depression or recession coming off the back of the oil prices and the banking collapses significantly dropped confidence. Then in 2020, you can see the impact of COVID coming through. And then a very strong rebound, actually, and very positive feelings as we came out of the recession, only, of course, to be impacted by the situation in the Ukraine, plus all of the economic uncertainty we're looking at here. So I think it's worth just reflecting that from a corporate perspective, there's a lot of impact here. So what does this mean in terms of sustainability or corporate responsibility? So the first thing I'd say is that there is a cost of living crisis going on, and I would say that that is a global cost of living crisis. Certainly in many countries in Europe, there are many people now who are struggling to meet their bills. So that has implications for the economy, has implications for corporate responsibility. Certainly there's been a lot of pressure in the UK on the energy sector because the energy prices in the UK particularly have increased by sometimes 300 or 400%. So that's put quite a lot of people into energy poverty. There's a lot of pressure on the agricultural sector. We've talked about the impact of farming practices, the impact of the cost of fertilizers. We see that there's going to have to be a radical transformation, and we're starting to see that coming through. People are talking about agricultural 4.0, which is the application of technology, whether it's drones or satellites or artificial intelligence, to applying technology and artificial intelligence to agriculture to really enhance and change the agricultural sector. Number three, there's a massive focus on energy efficiency. There's nothing like an increasing energy price to get people thinking about switching lights off, switching fans off, both at the corporate perspective but also at the domestic perspective, people at home. And then finally, I've put this acceleration of the energy transition, and I've put away from or possibly towards fossil fuels. I mean, the hope from a sustainability perspective is it will absolutely drive us towards more solar, more renewable, more hydro, more wind. We see that. But equally, there seem to be some sentiments in the marketplace which are pushing towards the expansion of traditional fossil fuels. Some of you may have seen yesterday in North America, in the United States, Biden has just signed off a very large oil exploration in Alaska, and environmentalists are questioning the implications of that from a climate perspective. So that's a starting point from a, if you like, an economic system perspective. The other trend, the other trends that we see coming through are very much trends from the stakeholder perspective. So this is coming from much more of a micro perspective, much more of an organizational perspective. And if we ask the question, why are organizations investing in sustainability? Why do they care? Well, the first answer there is employees. And some research I did with Henley Business School a few years ago suggests that this is possibly the strongest driver for organizations. If you want to be able to recruit the best people, if you want to be able to retain your best people, then you better have your corporate responsibility, your sustainability journey in place. Because quite frankly, the graduates of tomorrow won't come and work for you unless you are a responsible business and you're investing in this space. The second area is around customers, and whether that's business to business or whether that's business to consumer, we're seeing a huge amount of customer pressure coming through. So in the business to business space, I would say that most business to business customers are basically screening their suppliers. And if their suppliers don't meet the standard that's expected, they just remove them from the list. So you just won't even get on the short list for bidding for work if you haven't got the right policies and practices in place. And then in the consumer world, we're starting to see more people interested in terms of the sustainability of the products they buy. The third driver are partners. And again, there's a couple of dimensions to this. First of all, you will not be able to achieve your sustainability goals if you do it alone. And so partners are key. And secondly, we're also starting to see some choice editing of partners, of suppliers. So we are seeing people starting to say, sorry, I'm not prepared to work for you as an organization. So it's an interesting development in that whole partner space. Number four, regulators. Varies by country, by region. Certainly the European Union is very strong in terms of their regulation around sustainability. We'll come on in a minute to look about going beyond just pure carbon, but increasingly the European Union is making all businesses who are operating in Europe report on a whole range of topics, both social and environmental. In North America, we've got the SEC, the Stock Exchange Commission, which requires quite heavy levels of disclosure now around the carbon impacts of business. So again, there's definitely a trend in terms of regulation. And then the final one I've put here is investors. And it's been an interesting journey. I've been talking to our corporate investors probably for 10 or 12 years now, and the conversation has been really interesting in terms of the way it's developed. If I'm really open, the very first conversations we had with some of our shareholders, some of the investors, probably around about 2009, 2010, I had investors asking me, what questions should we be asking? So we then had quite an interesting conversation about our views on sustainability, the journey we were on, and almost what questions they should be challenging us with. Investors are getting much more sophisticated now in terms of the questions they're asking, much more challenging in terms of the revenues, the profit, the types of services that we're providing. So that whole piece is quite critical. And I've just put some more data points here in terms of those changing expectations. Somebody mentioned, it was mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, the interest in ESG investing. I think $1 in $3 was mentioned in terms of sustainability. Certainly, over the next 5 years, or for the 5 years 2021 to 2026, it's expected that ESG assets are going to probably around double. So you can see just how quickly people are focusing on there. And this is driven by, it's not just driven by, if you like, the trends of the moment or the desires at the moment. It's driven by a number of things, but one of which is the real awareness of the starting of climate change. And the fact that we've already had probably somewhere around 1.1 degree of warming compared to pre-industrial levels. And I always think that's worth remembering, because if people always talk about the Paris Agreement and this need to keep climate change or the heating to less than 1.5 degrees be above where we were before the Industrial Revolution, we've already had 1.1 degrees. We're practically in line for 1.5 degrees. In fact, I was with somebody from the World Meteorological Organization back in September, and they were saying there's a really strong probability that in the next couple of years we're going to go through the 1.5. And that's partly driven by the El Nino process. So he expects that we're going to go through the 1.5, and then the pressures are going to change and we're going to come back down below 1.5 before probably sometime in the next 10 years or so us crossing 1.5 more permanently. So we are getting quite close to those boundaries. Regulation, as I talked about before, that's driving investors. Investors are increasingly having to measure the carbon impact of their portfolios. And then there's also finally, a positive side, that there is growing evidence that organizations which are good in terms of ESG, good in terms of sustainability, are actually driving better financial performance. So if I think about those trends, what's the implication of those trends as a whole? Well, I suppose there's a few things here. I guess the key is probably, if I had to pick two things off that list, integrate sustainability to the strategy. Sustainability can't be an add-on. It has to be integrated to what you're trying to do. What's the purpose of your business? What are you trying to do? If sustainability is not integrated into that, you probably won't have success in the long term. And then secondly, I bring out the transparency piece as well. I think transparency is critical. Certainly from a Capgemini perspective, one of the things we've always tried to be is transparent about our objectives and our goals. We have an aspiration to be a net zero business by 2040, a whole series of targets below that. We disclose on them, we're transparent about them. The one thing that really frustrates me is where people make vague claims but then don't provide any information about those claims. There are companies out there saying we're net zero already, or we want to be net zero in 10 years' time, but they don't actually define what they mean by net zero. When we put our first press release out about net zero, we put out a press release with 4 or 5 very detailed footnotes. I think my press team thought I was crazy that I was putting all these footnotes in a press release. And the reason I put them there is I wanted to be clear about what we meant. I don't have a problem if anybody disagrees with my policies and my strategy and my targets, but let's have a conversation based on that, the reality of what those targets mean. Happy to have the conversation. Much less comfortable when organizations are making vague, unclear claims, which you can't have a proper conversation around. So the final trend I was going to then unpack very briefly is a broadening of the agenda, the ESG agenda, the sustainability agenda. If you look back over the last 10 years for most organizations have been very strong on climate, and particularly the piece I've put up there, very strong on climate mitigation. How do we reduce our carbon emissions? What we're moving now into is a world which is much, much broader. So I think the first step beyond reducing carbon emissions is recognizing that we need to adapt to climate change, this climate adaptation. The genie is out of the bottle. We are seeing more and more extreme weather events. We're seeing more and more impacts because of climate change. Certain businesses are being almost wiped out because of climate change. So this adaptation piece is key. Then we're seeing topics like circular economy, pollution, biodiversity, water. We're seeing all of these extra components of the environmental sustainability agenda, which from my perspective is fantastic because, if we just solve climate change and we don't tackle anything else, then we're not really going to make any progress. If we solve climate change but we wipe out biodiversity, then that's not going to help any of us. Then along with the environmental side, we're seeing an increasing focus on the social dimension. And I'll talk a little bit about that one in a second. And we're seeing a lot in the governance space as well, in good governance. So implications. There's a lot more social legislation coming through. So for example, in India, they have this Section 135, 2% legislation. So all large corporates in India have to invest 2% of their average profits in social and CSR type initiatives. And so for some large organizations, that means they're investing tens of millions, if not multiple tens of millions of dollars each year in investing in social impacts. We see legislation coming through in countries like the UK around social value. So every time Capgemini bids to the UK government for any public sector work, we have to demonstrate the social value which comes from delivering that work. And that would be the same for any of your industries as well. If you were supplying energy services or any other services to government, you would have to be able to define the social value. And then this interconnectedness piece is critical. We're seeing a lot of focus around that, and it's a really challenging area. So, challenge or opportunity? I guess the answer in short is a bit of both. But I think the real key has to be we have to look at it as an opportunity. We have to look at the opportunity in terms of the new markets which are forming, the opportunities in terms of driving the relationships which this gives us. I've been in here in Brazil for about a week, been meeting various clients, various events, and sustainability always gives you a fantastic opportunity for a conversation. And it's often a completely different conversation to a conversation that you would normally be having with a supplier or a customer. It seems to get down to something which is much more personal, much more values-driven in terms of how can we support each other. Sustainability is ultimately a collaboration, and we're not going to get to the levels of decarbonisation we need without deep collaboration. So just drawing it together, this is often some of the questions that we hear, and happy to dive into. If you've got these questions, we're happy to dive into those questions and have a conversation about those questions. But this is often the sort of starting point that we have when we're talking to clients about sustainability. And from my perspective, when I think about sustainability, and this is what really drove me to drive sustainability into Capgemini, when I think about sustainability, I see a business change problem. Probably the biggest business change problem that any of us are going to see, but essentially it's a business change problem. And Capgemini is all about business transformation. We've been working with our clients for over 50 years now on helping them transform, usually using IT, but not always. So if you want to have conversations about any of these topics, find me afterwards, or we can talk about it in the round table. And then I just wanted to flag this report. We do quite a lot of research on sustainability. We have a research institute, and they recently published this report, The World in Balance. So we interviewed over 2,000 executives from 670-ish organizations, and the majority revealed that they lack an overarching strategy, they lack a clear business case. In fact, 1 in 5 executives admitted that they didn't understand that there was a business case for eco-friendly operations. That's quite disturbing. And again, some of the data points you can download and read the report in its whole, but there's some data points here. And again, there's positives and negatives. So 64% of executives say that sustainability is part of their business agenda. So that's encouraging, but that means that 1 in 3 senior executives are saying that sustainability isn't part of their agenda, which is quite concerning. So have a look at that report. What's interesting when we pulled the conclusions together is we looked at the leaders in the pack, if you like. We call them the front runners, the experimenters, and the beginners. And what's clear is that the front runners were showing significantly higher than average revenues per employee and significantly higher profit margins than those who weren't engaging and weren't driving sustainability. So just to spend the last 2 minutes as I start to wrap up, I just thought what I wanted to do was share just 2 or 3 examples from Capgemini in terms of some of the things that we're doing in terms of embedding sustainability into the things that we do for ourselves and the things that we do with our clients. So number 1, this is our Energy Command Center. It's in Bangalore, and we've built this effectively a 24/7 command center which is monitoring all of our big campuses in India. And it monitors every light, every pump, every air conditioning unit, all of the electrical and energy and water-based assets we have across our site. And they're monitored 24/7. If something's not quite right, they get picked up straight away, and they can then be addressed. It's helped us drive down the energy consumption by nearly 30% in our Indian operations. So it makes quite a significant difference in terms of just applying technology at the low level in terms of energy. Second example I've put here is a completely different example. This is called Project Farm. It's a project that we did initially in Kenya, and now we're rolling it out. And it's about providing data to farmers, to rural farmers. The technology, it's nothing smartphone in here. This is purely text messages, SMS messages, and sending farmers SMS data points about, is it the right time to plant? Is it the right time to harvest? This is about providing rural farmers with information like, don't plant this week because we're expecting very heavy rains tomorrow, and if you plant this week, all your seeds will be washed away. So sometimes just really simple data can be a huge life-changing have a huge life-changing impact on rural livelihoods. And then the final one I've put is one example from the UK. We work with an organisation called Code Your Future, and Code Your Future is teaching refugees to code. So we're providing refugees with the ability to get really high-quality jobs in the technology sector. So again, for me, all of these are examples of how a large technology business like Capgemini can apply technology to make environmental and social positive outcomes. So just to wrap up, challenge or opportunity? Probably both, but I do really strongly believe that we all need to be thinking about the opportunity. We need to be thinking about, how do we go beyond just making money? How do we think about, doing good and making social impact? My strong belief is the companies that really survive in the future will be companies which are contributing positively to the environmental and the social agenda. And let me, at that point, stop, and I look forward to the conversation this morning. Thank you.